Hello and welcome to episode 1 of my tutorial series on how to code in Python. In this episode, we'll be covering variables, print statements, and doing some basic maths. So let's get started. But before we can do any of that fun stuff, we need to set up a workspace. There is an online Python editor called Replit, which is really simple to set up and use. So you want to go to Google and type in repl.it, then search and click on this first link that comes up. You want to sign up, and you can make a new account or sign in with Google. Then on the top right, you want to click on New REPL and then type Python into the search bar and select the first result. Then for the name, you want to type in something like tutorial and then click Create REPL. Then it will bring you to this page. You can close this and you can write code here. Once you've written some code, you can press run and the code will be run here. So now let's get right back into learning Python. Before we can do anything, we need to learn how to output things. So why do we need an output? Every bit of code will need to produce a result. That is called an output, or something that is the result of your program. For example, if I was making code that calculated 5 plus 10, the output would be 15. To make an output in Python, we use a print statement. So first, we need to write the word print. This is the print statement. Here we tell the computer to print something. Then we add brackets. The brackets tell the computer to print everything inside of it. Then inside of the brackets, we can write some text. For example, hello world. And what we write here will be sent as output. Note that when we write text, we have to put it in speech marks. I'll explain more about this later. Another thing to note is that when we print two things, we want to separate it with a comma. So for example, if I was to print hello and then world, I'd put print, then open brackets, and then type in speech marks hello, then put a comma, and then type in speech marks world. Now let's write some code. Pause the video now and write some code that prints your name and then your age. Now that you've unpaused it, here's the final result. So you want to print, then in speech marks, you can put my name, or whatever your name is, then close the speech marks, put a comma, and then put your age. I haven't put my age in speech marks here, but this doesn't really matter, and I'll explain more about this later. And we'll be using this print statement quite a lot in the future to show what the computer is doing it. We can also use it to find errors in our code. Now let's talk a bit about variables. What are variables? Variables are used to store information and to be referenced and manipulated by a computer program. This may be quite difficult to understand, but it gets easier later. In order to make a variable in Python, we do the following. First, we give the variable a name. I'm going to call it my variable. The value that we assign to this variable will be stored under that name. To assign a value, we put an equals sign, which shows the computer that we're creating a variable, and then a value, for example, 1. So now, whenever we type in my variable, the computer will think of 1, because my variable is 1. The value that we assign to the variable can have lots of different types. This value is a number, also called an integer. We'll cover more about variable types later. And it's time to code. Try to make a variable that stores the number 1 and then print the variable in Python. Pause the video until you have a solution. Welcome back, and let's have a look at the final result. So first of all, we set a variable called my variable to 1, and then we print the variable. When we print, we tell the computer to print my variable, and as soon as it thinks of my variable, it also thinks of 1, so it just prints 1. And we can name this variable a lot of different things, but it can't begin with a number, it can't have any special characters, and it can't have any spaces, otherwise the computer won't understand. Now let's talk about variable types. Variable types are used to tell the computer what it's working with. For example, if we wanted to add the numbers 1 and 2, we would store them as numbers, so we could get 3. But if we stored them as text, we could get 12. There are 4 basic variable types in Python. The first is a string. Strings store text and characters, like this is a sentence. This can also store numbers, but if we try to add them, it won't really work well because it doesn't think of them as numbers, it just thinks of them as text. The next variable type is an integer. Integers store whole numbers, for example 12. However, they can't store decimal numbers. To do that, we use floats. Floats can store decimal numbers, for example 1.5. And finally, the last variable type is called a boolean. Booleans store one of two values, true or false. To create the variables, we use different notations. When we write strings, we write speech marks around the text. When we write integers, we don't put anything around the number. When we write floats, we must include a decimal point. And when we write booleans, we either write true or false. It is important, however, to capitalize the true and the false, otherwise it won't work. Now let's talk a bit about maths. Doing math is one of the main purposes of a computer. A computer can only think in numbers, so adding and subtracting isn't very difficult. But you can do some basic maths to both integers and floats, as they both store numbers. Here's how. To do addition, we write 2 plus 3. And here, in this example, we create a variable, which is the sum of the numbers 2 and 3. To do subtraction, we use a minus sign. So my variable is 5 minus 1. That's the same as writing my variable is equal to 4. To do multiplication, we write my variable is 3 times 5. So that's the same as writing my variable is equal to 15. To write times, instead of using an X, we use a star. Finally, for division, we write a slash, and it must be a forward slash. So my variable is 4 divided by 2. That's the same as writing my variable is equal to 2. It's time to do some coding. Make two variables called var1 and var2 that store the numbers 3 and 5. Then create a new variable called total where you add var1 and var2. Print the result. Pause the video now and get coding. You've unpaused the video, so let's look at the code. First, we make var1, and we tell the computer that whenever it thinks of var1, it should think of 3. Then we do the same with var2. Whenever the computer thinks of var2, it thinks of 5. Next, we create a variable called total, which is the sum of var1 and var2. So when the computer sees this line, it would think of that total is 3 plus 5, which is 8. And then we can print that, and now the computer, when it's thinking of total, it thinks of 8, so it just prints 8. That's the end of this tutorial, but before we finish, let's do a little quiz. Question 1. The variable hello world is A, string, B, integer, C, float, or D, boolean. Question 2. A boolean stores A, whole numbers, B, decimals, C, true or false, or D, text. Question 3. To output multiple things in one line, we separate variables with A, a colon, B, a comma, C, a full stop, or D, a semicolon. Question 4. The variable 1.0 is A, a string, B, an integer, C, a float, or D, a boolean. Now let's look at the answers. So the answer to question 1 was A, a string, because hello world is text, and strings store text, so hello world is a string. The answer to question 2 was C, because a boolean stores two values, true or false. The answer to question 3 was B, because when we print two values, we separate them with a comma. And finally, the answer to question 4 was C. 1.0 has a decimal point, so it is a float. Although 1.0 is the same as 1, which is an integer, it isn't a whole number because it has a decimal point, and only floats have decimal points, so 1.0 is a float. Thank you for watching. If you have any feedback, leave it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next episode.